Consumers want to know the facts about the products they buy, but America's agricultural landscape is not easy to navigate. Between different companies, scientific advancement, government regulations, advertisement campaigns, and an unhealthy amount of myth and misconception, anyone would be hard-pressed to make sense of it. That's where Real Ag comes in. Kyle Bauer and the Real Ag crew bring you truthful, unbiased information about real agricultural concerns. From the producers who make your food, to the store where you buy the final product, and everything in between. This is Real Ag. Now, here's your host, Kyle Bauer.
Put simply, irrigation is the taking of water from one place and using it to water crops in another. That sounds simple, but there's a lot more to it. Irrigation is our topic today on Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
Before we get too far, let's get the basics of irrigation.
So irrigation is basically the applying of water to the soil to help for plant growth when rainfall and stored soil water is insufficient. So it basically is augmenting natural rainfall. In many places in the world, we have very productive farm ground that has insufficient rainfall during the growing season when the crop needs it. Also, there's areas that have periodic drought, and irrigation can be very beneficial in terms of providing enough water for optimal plant growth in these locations. Irrigation has really been around for somewhere between 6,000, 8,000 years. It's mentioned in the Bible that irrigation was necessary in some locations. Some of the earliest probably developed in Egypt around the Nile River, and then also in the Tigris-Euphrates area, what we call the Fertile Crescent. It's now part of present-day Iraq. And basically they were just diverting water from the rivers, sometimes actually just carrying the water from the rivers to smaller gardens and stuff. It could be fairly dramatic differences that might be occurring. I mean, there would be increased hunger in parts of the world, and in some places even starvation would be occurring. And when those problems start to develop, then that can lead to, strife between countries. One country has more resources than another to buy food if necessary. And so without irrigation, some of these countries would be fairly hard pressed. If we think about it, about 40% of the food that we grow in this world is through irrigation, and that's only on about 25% of the land resource. So irrigation allows us to have more food than would be possible on a smaller percentage of the land area. And we don't actually have to develop some of this this virgin land that hasn't been broken out for production yet.
There are several different types of irrigation. Each one has its own advantages and applications.
Irrigation is basically divided into three major subdivisions or methods. And those methods are surface irrigation, sprinkler irrigation, and micro irrigation. Of these, surface irrigation would be the oldest. It would be what was practiced in ancient times before we had any kind of mechanical means. And still, actually, worldwide, there's probably more surface irrigation than any other type of irrigation. And the reason is it's cheaper to develop, and it also uses less energy to operate it because the water is just being distributed on the surface of the ground. The major drawback of probably surface irrigation is that it tends to be less efficient because it's being spread over a larger land area, and there's also some tailwater or runoff from the fields that has to be handled in some fashion. I don't mean that surface irrigation cannot be efficient, but oftentimes it's just difficult to be able to economically apply that much management to the point that you can be efficient with surface irrigation. The next evolution in irrigation probably would be sprinkler irrigation, which was developed largely in the 20th century. That's when most sprinkler irrigation was developed. And of that, something that's pretty prevalent in the Great Plains would be center pivot irrigation. And the first center pivot was developed actually in eastern Colorado in 1948. And since that time, we've seen the major development of sprinklers, and the sprinkler manufacturers are situated in Nebraska, most of them, worldwide, the larger manufacturers. And it is actually the principal irrigation method in the Great Plains today, and also in other parts of the world. About 80 to somewhere between 80 and 90% of the irrigation in the Great Plains is now with sprinkler irrigation. A lot of hardware associated with sprinkler irrigation. You have the distribution lines, whether they're on the surface or whether they're on a center pivot or a lateral move sprinkler. You have these distribution pipes, and then from that you have a sprinkler nozzle that is spraying the water out over the crop to irrigate it. Another great opportunity that we have in the future, and it's already occurring to some extent, but we know it will increase, would be the combined use of nutrients and irrigation. In other words, that we're applying the nutrients through the irrigation system. And you can look at this as kind of like spoon feeding the crop. So the crop has needs for nutrients and the crop has needs for irrigation. By using this combined nutrient and irrigation management, which we call fertigation, where we're actually applying the fertilizer with the irrigation system, we can provide the crop just what it needs, just in time, and just in the right place. The next evolution would be perhaps micro-irrigation. And micro-irrigation is also known as drip irrigation. However, micro-irrigation encompasses some of the other types of low-volume irrigation, which would be, say, micro sprays or micro sprinklers, which are not necessarily used so much in the Great Plains, but they are used in some parts to irrigate tree crops where they need a larger wetting pattern than is possible with, say, drip irrigation. We've been working with subsurface drip irrigation here at Kansas State University fairly extensively since 1989. And our reasons to be doing this is that we know it's a very efficient type of irrigation. It has some issues that, it's fairly high cost, and that's one of the major impediments to development of micro-irrigation in the Great Plains. However, it has some tremendous advantages in being able to put very, very small amounts of water onto the crop so that you don't have a lot of runoff, you don't have a lot of evaporation from the soil surface. Also, by putting small amounts on, you can control the drainage and leaching of chemicals. So it has a lot of advantages. The big difference that micro-irrigation is from the other two types of irrigation is that you're applying water in a very localized region. In fact, in some parts of the world, they don't call it micro-irrigation, they don't call it drip irrigation, they call it localized irrigation. With the idea that you're targeting the specific parts of the plant root zone or the canopy of the crop, and then the other areas are left dry. And so that results in some water savings. Traditionally, one of the, where you might think of that drip irrigation or micro-irrigation has only been around about 60 years. That's the modern drip irrigation. If we think back to ancient times, there was the hanging gardens of Babylon, and somehow they had to be irrigated, and it's very likely that they had some type of micro-irrigation. We don't know the specifics of how it was done, but it's likely that they had to have some type of micro-irrigation to accomplish that. We're kind of in the information age now, and so information is power, information is ability to manage, and that applies also to irrigation. In our research, for years now, we've been managing our micro-irrigation with automation. So I can decide on a particular day which plots get irrigated, and I can set that up and it'll automatically occur. That same technology can be used on center pivot irrigation, and farmers are already beginning to utilize this. Farmers when a rainfall event occurs, maybe 20 miles from their house, they can have instrumentation that's telling them that rainfall is occurring. And they have the opportunity to shut that sprinkler down and then start it up the next day. They can do that remotely through resources, through radio and internet resources that are occurring. You know, from the early days of diversion, where water was just originally being carried by a bucket to a small garden area, to where we have large fields today. You know, the fields today can be up to 320 acres in one block that might be irrigated with a center pivot irrigation. That's a considerable advance that's occurred. The increases in irrigation area that's been accomplished with the more mechanized types of irrigation allows for much greater food production that's going to be necessary to feed this global population. It's estimated that the global population in 2050 will be about 9 billion people in the world. And to do that, we've got to increase food production about 60%. One of these tools that we'll have in our toolbox will be irrigation. We will probably in some areas have to develop some lands that's currently not under irrigation. Some of the physical challenges to irrigation is that you know, there's still areas of the world that have productive soils that don't have water. In the United States, in the 20th century, we developed some of these areas by creating diversion dams. Dammed up water and pumped it to other locations. Some of the Imperial Valley of California was accomplished through diversion of water from snow melt from the Rocky Mountains. The economical challenges to irrigation primarily lie in the fluctuating crop prices. There's opportunities to develop these more efficient types of irrigation, such as sprinkler irrigation or even micro irrigation for these lower value crops. However, when you have tremendous crop price fluctuation, a farmer may or may not be able to make that step. So sometimes there has been availability of cost share from the government. Basically the society trying to say, okay, we would like for irrigation to improve, the efficiency of irrigation to improve, so that we don't have environmental problems, so that we have more water to transfer to the cities. And as a result, society will help with some cost share that allows the farmers to develop these more efficient types of irrigation.
Irrigation has a legal aspect to it. In order to irrigate your land, you need a legal document called a water right.
The allocation of water resources is governed by the Kansas Water Appropriation Act. That was passed in 1945, and so there were uses in place before then, and they were brought into that appropriation system. But since then, water is essentially allowed to be developed under a Water Appropriation Act. The Kansas Water Appropriation Act essentially says all the water of the state is for the use of the public of the state. A water right is essentially a right to use that public resource, and they're applied for to the Division of Water Resources. You have a specific use that you want to make of the water. It has a specific point of diversion, place of use, quantities and rates that are allowed to put that water to use. Irrigation is the largest use, but municipal use, industrial use, domestic use, stock water use, hydropower are among the 15 different uses of water under the Appropriation Act. I mean, there are two major types of water resources we have in Kansas. Obviously the surface water resources that are in our streams and water courses, and then the groundwater resources that are part of the aquifers we have in our state. So the eastern Kansas tends to be dominated by surface water. We have less surface water in the west. And our groundwater resources, the most significant of those is our Ogallala High Plains that's underlying much of western Kansas. An aquifer is an underground body of water that produces water to wells, basically. There's underground water that's extractable. Clays have lots of water in them, but they don't yield water to wells. So you're typically looking at a sandy sort of formation that has water in it. Water development in Kansas is governed by what's called the Prior Appropriation Doctrine, and it's designed to protect investment in water resource development from being subsequently taken away by what we call a junior appropriator. So first in time means the older water rights, when there's a time of shortage, get the water before the junior or newer water rights. Legally, under the Appropriation Act, all uses are the same. So it doesn't matter. The first water right gets the water first, no matter what the use is. Now, economically, some of the uses are more at an advantage. Municipal industrial uses are typically higher values, and so they can, at times when water, they can, for example, purchase water rights from irrigators and convert them to use. So there's, although all water uses are the same legally, economically, certain uses have an advantage. Much of our state has closed to new water rights, new appropriations, western Kansas, much of central, and the way we accommodate new uses is essentially purchase and conversion of existing water rights. In times of plenty, all surface water users have access to their full rights, but in times of shortage, we essentially have to regulate the junior users to provide water to the seniors. So they'll either have to quit using it or go to a backup source of water. Well, there's something on the order of 27,000 wells that are authorized for irrigation use currently. We have on the order of 32,000 water rights that have actually been developed and continue to remain active. About 80% of those are irrigation water rights, and the rest of them are for other uses, municipal, industrial, stock water, and so forth. About 80% of the water is used for irrigation. We basically are finding ways to use irrigation water more efficiently, putting in more efficient irrigation systems. A lot of the irrigation uses in the west and the Ogallala is declining, and with that is a decline in the amount of water that can be diverted, and so that's sort of part of this as well. Now there's other parts of the state where the use is increasing. For example, in eastern Kansas, more population, more power production, is leading to increases. So in some areas of the Ogallala of western Kansas, we've already used most of it. There's parts of Groundwater Management District Number 1. About a third of the water rights in that district are no longer viable for their irrigation use. And so there's some areas of the Ogallala where essentially we've already fully utilized it. There are other areas where we have decades, if not centuries, of life remaining, and so it really depends upon where you're at.
Of course, the people putting these concepts into practice are the farmers themselves.
Well, generally they turn the water in from the reservoir at Webster at the end of June, 1st of July, and we usually irrigate until the end of August. Well, that's the major portion of time when it's using the most water. Corn will use a third of an inch on a real hot day when it's really growing hard and fast. And it uses more than any other crop we plant. And without it, the last 2 or 3 years we would have had nothing. We have a cow herd and a feedlot, and without it we wouldn't be able to keep feed around for everything. On a dry year, we have sold off some of the cows, but we'd have probably a lot less right now if it wasn't for the irrigation. Well, in 1959, when I was a little kid, we started out, and this whole district was designed for flood irrigation. And the way that works is you pull what we call a head ditch at the top end of the field, and you put siphon tubes down each row. And then you set them and wait 12 hours. And we counted rows a lot, which means we go to the end of the field every 12 hours and write down on a piece of paper as we walk through the end of the fields which rows have come through and which ones haven't, trying to save water. And it was very labor intensive. And we moved from that to gated pipe wherever it would work. And now I've installed 4 pivots, center pivot systems, and they're a lot more efficient. We're using a third of the water that we did when we was flood irrigation using siphon tubes. So that aspect's great, and we do a lot better job of irrigating. The coverage on the field is more uniform. When you flood irrigate, the top end of the field where you start your water down the rows gets probably a third more, at least, water than you do at the bottom end of the field. So when you get into hot weather like we usually have, that end of the field suffers and doesn't yield near as much, and maybe doesn't yield anything at all. And you avoid all that with a center pivot. Plus you can do a lot of other things with it. You can, I put on fertilizer with it 2 or 3 revolutions, and that spreads my fertilization intervals out. We put on some before we plant, we put on some at planting, then we put it on 2 or 3 more times with the pivot after the crop's growing. That way it spreads out the intervals there, and there's less chance to lose it, and it's just like spoon feeding the crop. You get better utilization of your nitrogen. Technology's just starting, I think, in agriculture. When I started college in 1968, the computer was just getting started. And we all know what that's blossomed into. And I think we're about right there in agriculture, just the beginning. Because with the global positioning equipment and all the different things you can do with that, like when we plant, there's a big learning curve, but we're still working the bugs out. But when we plant, we try to variable rate our seed and our fertilizer as we go through the field. We soil tested every 2.5 acres on our irrigation fields, and then we take that analysis and sit down and figure out how much plant population we want on each particular 2.5 acre plot in the field, and the same with the fertilization. So in turn, you get more seeds per acre and more fertilizer per acre in your ground that will produce more. And then when you get into your ground that don't produce as much, you can cut back, and like on the pivots, we plant straight through on the corners that we don't irrigate, and it actually we'll plant 30-some thousand plants of corn on the irrigated, and we'll cut back to 18 or 22 on the corners where we can't get any water. So that helps keep them from burning up quite so fast, and all those different things help cut back on our input costs, because your seed costs so much and your fertilizer, you don't want to be wasting any of it. My dad started irrigating on this farm out of the river, and then we bought the farm right beside us, and we cleared a bunch of stuff, trees and junk off the ground, and he got at that time you could get more water rights, so he got them, and we developed that, and then we leveled some other ground to where it would run water, and I think we've got 5 different water rights on this place. One in 1953, which is a good right, and the rest of them are later than that. But I don't think you can get any rights anymore anyplace. For instance, if you wanted to put a pivot in, you could build those water rights, and you'd have 100 acre feet to put on 130 acres, and that would probably raise a pretty good crop. Well, I've gotten older and I can't work that hard anymore, so it's helped me a lot. And a lot of the farmers in this part of the country are getting older, and some of them just don't irrigate anymore because of that. And the younger generation carrying siphon tubes around twice a day isn't much fun, and so they're not real interested in it either. So it definitely helps on that aspect. They cost too much, but I don't know, myself, instead of spending $3,000 or $4,000 on land, I just been developing what I already have by putting, managing it better with the fertility and the variable rate stuff, and putting pivots in and things like that.
Irrigation is vital to our society. We hope this show has given you a glimpse into the complexities of this practice. For the Real Ag crew, I'm Kyle Bauer, and this has been Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
The Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.